Ethan Brooks slammed the cabin door behind him, letting out a deep breath as he threw his duffel bag onto the couch. The silence was exactly what he needed. No meetings, no investors breathing down his neck, and no reporters invading his privacy. Just peace. He had rented this quiet cabin deep in the Colorado mountains to escape the chaos of his multi-million-dollar tech business. He wasn't running away. Ethan never ran. But after months of constant work, he needed a break. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered trees. His fingers tightened around the hot cup of coffee he just poured. That's when he saw her, a woman bundled in a thick coat, struggling to carry firewood across her small porch. Her cabin was right next to his, but still far enough to give them both privacy. She tripped, and the firewood fell from her arms, rolling across the porch. Ethan sighed and put his coffee down. He wasn't here to make friends, but watching her struggle made it hard to ignore. Before he could change his mind, he grabbed his jacket and went outside. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed as he walked toward her cabin. "Need help?" His deep voice broke the quiet of the mountains. The woman spun around, eyes wide. She had light brown hair tucked into a messy bun, and her cheeks were red from the cold. But it was her eyes, bright, determined, and a little wary, that caught his attention. She hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, that would be great." Ethan crouched down and easily picked up the fallen logs. She watched him for a moment, then bent down to help. "Are you new here?" she asked, brushing snow off her gloves. Ethan nodded as he stacked the firewood by her door. "Rented the cabin next door for a while." "The fancy one?" she said with a small smirk. "Figures." His brow lifted. "Figures?" she shrugged. "I saw the car you pulled up in. Not exactly a mountain man's truck." Ethan glanced back at his sleek black SUV. It was worth more than most people's homes, but he hadn't thought about how it looked out here. "And you are?" he asked, changing the subject. "Ava Hudson," she said, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. "I live here year-round. Not many people stay long in that cabin. They usually come for a week, maybe two, then leave." Ethan dusted his hands off. "I'm not most people." Ava tilted her head and studied him. "No, I don't think you are." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. He had spent years building walls around himself, keeping people at a distance. But here, in the middle of nowhere, with a woman who seemed to actually see him, those walls felt a little less solid. "Thanks for the help," Ava said, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded. "Any time." As he turned to leave, he could feel her eyes on him, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he wanted to be alone. The next morning, Ethan stepped outside with his coffee. The crisp mountain air stung his skin. The quiet was exactly what he wanted until he heard the sound of an axe splitting wood. He looked toward Ava's cabin where she stood, swinging an axe with practiced ease. Each strike sent a sharp crack through the frosty air. He leaned against his porch railing, watching. She was smaller than most people who used an axe, but she worked with precision. Her breath formed little clouds in the cold. She must have felt his gaze because she looked up and wiped her brow with the back of her glove, a slight smile on her face. Ethan smirked and took a sip of his coffee. "Didn't take you for the lumberjack type." She rolled her eyes, but there was amusement in them. "What? You think just because I live in the mountains I have a personal firewood delivery service?" He shrugged. "I wouldn't be surprised." Ava laughed, then set the axe down and brushed wood dust off her coat. "So, Mr. Fancy Cabin, what exactly brings you out here? You don't look like the type who enjoys solitude." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to explaining himself, especially not to a woman he'd just met. Needed a break from work, he finally said. She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether to ask more. Must be some job if you're willing to freeze in the middle of nowhere just to escape it. His jaw tightened. Something like that. Ava nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. Well, if you ever get tired of instant coffee and frozen meals, I cook every night. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Are you inviting me to dinner? She smirked. I'm just saying. If you show up, I won't turn you away. With that, she picked up the axe and went back to chopping wood, leaving Ethan standing there, wondering why a simple invitation from her felt more interesting than any business deal he had ever closed. That evening, Ethan knocked on Ava's door. He wasn't sure why he came. Maybe it was the smell of something delicious coming from her cabin, or maybe it was the restlessness he had been feeling since their conversation that morning. When she opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to mild amusement. Didn't think you'd actually show up, she said. Ethan shrugged. Figured I'd take you up on that offer. Ava stepped aside and let him in. The cabin was warm, with the glow from the fireplace casting soft shadows on the wooden walls. It was cozy and lived in, nothing like the clean, expensive luxury of his own place. Hope you like stew, she said, ladling food into 2 bowls. Ethan sat at the small wooden table watching as she moved around the kitchen easily. It was clear she was comfortable in her own little world. You live out here alone? He asked. She placed a bowl in front of him and sat across the table. Yep, moved here 2 years ago. Why? Ethan asked. Ava stirred her spoon through her stew. Same reason you're here, I guess. Needed a break from everything. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that more than he wanted to admit. They ate in silence for a moment before Ava spoke again. So, what do you do when you're not hiding out in the mountains? She asked. Ethan hesitated. He didn't talk about his work unless he had to. People either wanted something from him or treated him differently once they knew who he was. I run a company, he said vaguely. Ava raised an eyebrow. That's not an answer. Ethan smirked. It's an answer, just not a detailed one. She studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Fair enough. You don't seem like the corporate type. Ethan chuckled. And what type do I seem like? Ava tapped a finger against her chin, pretending to think. Broody, mysterious, probably terrible at relaxing. He laughed for real this time. Not bad. They fell into easy conversation, and before Ethan knew it, hours had passed. It had been a long time since he'd sat down and talked to someone without an agenda. Ava wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't looking for anything from him. She was just being herself. When he finally stood up to leave, Ava walked him to the door. You know, for a guy who came out here for solitude, you're not very good at staying away. Ethan smirked. Maybe solitude isn't what I need after all. Ava's eyes flickered with something unreadable before she gave him a small smile. Good night, Ethan. As he stepped back into the cold night, Ethan realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work or the pressure waiting for him back home. He was thinking about her. The next few days passed in a blur of crisp mountain air, quiet moments, and unexpected companionship. Ethan found himself spending more time with Ava than he planned. It wasn't just the warmth of her cabin or the way she cooked meals that felt real. It was her. She was different from the people in his world. There was no pretense, no agenda. She didn't care about his money, didn't ask him personal questions, and didn't seem impressed by the expensive SUV he had driven in. It was refreshing. One evening, as another snowfall covered the mountains, Ethan found himself at Ava's cabin again, this time helping her stack firewood before the storm got worse. They worked in comfortable silence, the sound of logs thudding against each other the only noise between them. You know, Ava said after a while, brushing snow from her coat, I'm starting to think you never planned on being alone out here. Ethan smirked as he set the last log down. I did. Ava gave him a knowing look. And yet, here you are again. He didn't have a response for that, so he simply shrugged and shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. The truth was, he didn't want to be alone, not when being around her felt so easy. As they stepped onto her porch, a strong gust of wind howled through the trees, sending a flurry of snowflakes swirling around them. Ava shivered, rubbing her arms. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took off his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders. She blinked up at him, surprised. "Ava, you'll freeze," she said. "I'll survive," he replied, his voice rougher than he meant. Something changed between them in that moment. The air felt heavier, charged with a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Ava held his gaze, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she pulled his coat tighter around herself and stepped back. "Come inside before the storm gets worse," she said. He followed her inside, shutting the door behind them. The warmth of the cabin surrounded him, but it didn't shake off the tension still hanging between them. Ava moved to the kitchen and began filling a kettle with water. "Tea?" she asked, her voice softer now. Ethan nodded, watching her. She seemed so at home here, in this life she had built away from everything. He wondered what had made her leave the world behind to choose this quiet life over the chaos of everyday life. As if sensing his thoughts, she glanced at him. "You never told me what you're running from." He exhaled and rubbed his jaw. "I'm not running." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you doing?" Ethan hesitated. He had spent years keeping his personal life locked away, never letting anyone see past the surface. But with Ava, those walls didn't seem as necessary. "Work took over everything," he admitted. "I built something from nothing, and somewhere along the way I forgot why I started." Ava leaned against the counter, studying him. "So, you came here to remember?" Ethan met her gaze. "Something like that." She was quiet for a moment before nodding. "I get it." He frowned slightly. "Do you?" Ava sighed, looking down at her hands. "I used to have a life that wasn't this," she said quietly, and it caught his attention. "What kind of life?" he asked. She hesitated, then gave a small, almost sad smile, one that felt like it belonged to someone else. Ethan waited, sensing there was more. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer. "I was engaged once," she said. His stomach tightened unexpectedly. He hadn't thought about her past, about the possibility of someone else. "What happened?" he asked. Ava looked out the window at the falling snow. "I realized I was building a future that wasn't mine," she said. "I was doing what everyone expected, not what I wanted." Ethan didn't say anything, letting her words settle. "So I walked away," she said simply, "left everything behind, and came here." He studied her for a long moment. "And do you regret it?" She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Not for a second." Something in his chest tightened at her words. He understood that feeling, the weight of expectations, the suffocation of a life that wasn't really yours. The kettle whistled, breaking the heavy silence. Ava quickly poured hot water into 2 mugs and handed one to him. Their fingers brushed briefly as she passed it. Ethan swallowed hard. He had come here to escape, to clear his head. He hadn't planned on meeting someone like her, someone who saw past the surface and made him question everything he thought he wanted. As the storm raged outside, it became clear that he wasn't just looking for solitude anymore. He was looking for her. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the windows, and the snow piled high outside. The storm had settled in for the night, and Ethan knew he wasn't going anywhere. Not that he wanted to. Ava sat across from him at the small wooden table, her fingers curled around a steaming mug of tea. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across her face and highlighting the quiet contemplation in her eyes. He had learned so much about her in the past few days, more than he had expected, and yet It still didn't feel like enough. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but full of meaning. Ethan set his mug down and exhaled slowly. "So, what happens after this?" he asked. Ava's gaze lifted to meet his. She looked cautious. "After what?" "This storm, this." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Whatever this is between us." Something flickered in her eyes, but she looked away. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Don't do that. Don't pretend like you don't feel it, too." Ava swallowed, her fingers tightening around her mug. "I didn't come here to start something new," she admitted. Ethan studied her, reading between the lines. "Because you're afraid?" Her jaw tightened. "Because I built a life for myself that doesn't rely on anyone else." He exhaled sharply. "And you think letting me in would change that?" Ava met his gaze, something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. "Wouldn't it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He had spent years keeping people at a distance, focused only on his company and success. It had taken coming here, meeting her, to realize how empty that success felt without someone to share it with. "I don't want to take anything from you, Ava," he said quietly. "I just don't want to leave here without knowing what this could be." Her breath caught slightly, but she shook her head. "You have a whole life waiting for you outside these mountains, Ethan. A career, responsibilities. I can't compete with that." His jaw tightened. "It's not about competition." "Then what is it about?" she challenged. Ethan stood up suddenly, running a hand through his hair. "It's about the fact that I haven't thought about work, deadlines, or anything else since I met you. It's about the fact that, for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm running on autopilot." Ava's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Ethan took a step closer. "It's about the fact that when I look at you, I see something I didn't even realize I was missing." The room felt small and full of tension. The fire crackled, the wind howled, but all Ethan could focus on was the way Ava's breathing had changed and how her fingers trembled slightly against her mug. Then she stood slowly, and Ethan's pulse raced as she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the firelight dancing in her eyes. "And what if I told you I was scared?" she whispered. His throat tightened. "Then I'd tell you that I am too." A shaky breath left her lips, and then finally she closed the distance between them. The moment their lips met, everything else faded away. Ethan's hands found her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers slid into his hair. The kiss was slow and searching, full of all the words they hadn't been able to say. When they finally pulled apart, Ava rested her forehead against his, their breaths mixing. "Ava," Ethan murmured, "I'm not asking for forever. I'm just asking for now." She closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." Relief washed over him as he pulled her back into his arms. Maybe this wasn't the life either of them had planned. But in that moment, surrounded by the quiet storm outside, it felt like exactly where they were meant to be. The days that followed passed with a quiet, unspoken understanding between them. Ethan never imagined that something as simple as waking up to the sound of Ava humming in the kitchen, or sitting with her on the porch while the sun set over the snow-covered mountains, could feel so natural. But it did. He had stopped counting the days since he arrived. The deadline he had set for himself, the moment he would pack up and return to his world, felt less like something that had to happen and more like a far-off idea. How could he leave when every moment with Ava felt like something he had been searching for without even realizing it? Tonight, she was curled up next to him on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her as the fire crackled in the hearth. Ethan had one arm draped along the back of the couch, close enough that his fingers brushed against her shoulder whenever she shifted. It had been a slow evening filled with quiet conversation and a kind of peace he had never thought he would crave. Ava turned her head slightly, her gaze flickering up to meet his. "You're thinking too hard." Ethan smirked. "That obvious?" She nodded, setting her mug of tea on the small wooden table beside her. "You get this look when something's on your mind, like you're trying to solve a problem." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Maybe I am." Ava studied him for a moment before tilting her head. "Tell me." For a second, Ethan hesitated, but then he realized that with her he didn't need to overthink things. She wasn't looking for a perfect answer. She just wanted the truth. "I don't know how I'm supposed to go back," he admitted. Something in her expression shifted, but she didn't look away. "To your life?" Ava asked. Ethan nodded. "To meetings, deals, people who only see me for what I can give them. After this, after you, it all feels—" He stopped, unsure how to explain it. Ava inhaled slowly, pressing her lips together. "Empty," she finished. His eyes met hers, and in that moment he knew she understood. "Yeah," he said quietly. Ava looked away, her fingers curling around the fabric of her sweater. "You don't have to go back to that, you know?" Ethan studied her, something twisting in his chest. "And what do I do instead?" Ava's gaze lifted to meet his again. "Stay." His breath caught. For all the moments they had shared, for all the quiet understanding between them, this was the first time she had asked for more. She must have seen the conflict on his face because she quickly looked away, shaking her head. "Forget it, I shouldn't have said that." Before she could pull away, Ethan reached for her hand. "Ava." She exhaled, her fingers tightening around his. I know what it's like to feel trapped in a life you don't want. And I know what it's like to finally find something that makes you feel free again. I don't want you to leave, if it means going back to something that doesn't make you happy." Ethan swallowed hard. "And what if what makes me happy is you?" Ava's breath hitched, her grip tightening on his hand. "Then you have to decide if that's enough." The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. He had spent years chasing after success, building a future around power and control. But here, with her, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He reached up, cupping her face gently. "I don't want to go back to a life that feels empty, Ava, but I also don't want you to think I'm staying just to escape it." Ava searched his face, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Then why would you stay?" Ethan brushed his thumb along her cheek, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I've spent years building an empire, and not once did it feel as right as this does. As you do." Ava's eyes shimmered, her lips parting, as if she wanted to say something, but instead she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply breathed together, the weight of everything unspoken settling between them. Then finally, Ava whispered, "Okay." And just like that, the decision was made, not with grand gestures or promises, but with the quiet certainty that some things were worth holding on to. Ethan wasn't going back, not when everything he wanted was right here in front of him.